Hi, I'd really like to talk to you about a $10 billion problem that we have. It's a problem that's actually going to get bigger, and we know it is, and it's becoming more complex as the day goes by. We're sitting on our hands and we're not doing that much about it. It's a problem that's impacting about 100,000 people at this very moment, and that's growing pretty much every day, and we can actually see it in particular areas such as cities, but then also we're also seeing it in regional areas as well. It is homelessness and poverty. And that's a pretty big number when we think about it, 100,000 people, but I actually think it's a pretty manageable problem. And, the more that we kind of think about this, and the deeper it gets, the more complex it is. And you start to realise that each of those 100,000 people, not only do they have their own stories, but the issues that they're dealing with are incredibly broad, deep, and no one instance is the same. So, as Annie's just said, in 2012 I co-founded an organisation called Street Smugglers, and so we're dedicated to a vision where homelessness isn't the only option. That's a pretty broad idea, and the way that we've realised that is kind of working at the two very extremes. And I'm a big data nerd. I love economics, and because it gives this wonderful quantifying number here. So at that $10 billion, and that's really the figure you need to keep in mind because that's a lot of money. And overall, in Western Australia, only $30 million is dedicated each year to helping disadvantaged people who are suffering through poverty and things like that. So we're not dealing with great numbers in trying to solve this, but it is such a huge cost. So I've actually been homeless twice. And so I did it first by myself last year. I spent a week on the streets, and then this year I took my two older brothers. It was both were challenging for very different reasons. So one of the things that you realise when you do go homeless and when you are experiencing homelessness is that it is incredibly isolating. You feel as if you're trapped in a glass cage. It's not fun, you're alone, except for you're seeing so many people around you all at once. And all you really want is some interaction with people. But even though you're coming up with people and you might even say, do you have $1? Can I get some water? Anything like that. Or even when you're dealing with the service providers, you still feel as if there's a distance. And that's one of the really big issues that's out there. So when I went with my two older brothers earlier this year, my brother Matthew, who is an interesting guy. He's your typical older brother. He's very blokey and masculine and into all of that sort of stuff. And he actually did one of the really most profound shifts on this sort of issue that I've ever seen. And so at the beginning of the week, he was talking about, why don't these people just go get a job? Why can't they just go find a bed somewhere? Things like that, and these are very typical responses to when we see homelessness and poverty in our cities, in our suburbs, and in our regions. I've been able to get on with my life, even though I've had my own adversity, but why are these people like this? By the end of the week, he actually had such a profound change that it was worth writing down and taking to the different service providers and in our advocacy with politicians. He was talking now about, well, we need education and training for people who have been out of the workforce for a serious amount of time. We also need adequate housing, and housing that is actually applicable to different groups of people, which is such a dramatic change to saying this was almost their fault in the beginning. And that is one of the really big things that we have in Australia, is that somehow we've reached a point where we think that people who are down on their luck, it is their problem. So one of the homeless people that I've met, her name's Mary, and she's been homeless a couple of times, but this time it was actually because she was leaving an abusive relationship. But while she's been on the street, she has been physically and sexually assaulted. She's in her late 40s, and the likelihood of her returning to her own home is pretty low, and she's going to be in and out of care and support for a really long time, and her life expectancy is plummeting as we speak. So one of the things that she's done, and she's recognised this, is that the chance that she's going to get the adequate help that she needs is pretty low. But in kind of seeing the long-term game, she's been able to take on a really maternal sort of role for the young homeless people that are out there. And there are a lot of young homeless people. About 45% of all homeless people in Australia are aged under 30. And there is a really large growing number aged under 12. So there's actually a young man that she looks after. He's 13 now. And when I say look after, she gives him advice, lets him know when things are going on, things that like a friend or an older sibling would do. And his name's Mac, and he comes from a really difficult position. So he's been homeless since he was 12. His mother was never really interested in being a parent, and his father and his brother are now in jail. And then he was having a bad time at school. So then, successively, things were coming up, and he just couldn't deal with it. His family wasn't there to support him, and so he ended up going, I need to leave this environment. And that is an incredibly mature step to take that very few can actually make. And for a 12-year-old to make it, as he was at that time, was incredible. So those are really interesting sort of experiences. And homeless people always have the most fascinating stories that you could ever hear. They're never quite simple or anything like that. I often think about in my own experience. I come from a fairly run-of-the-mill sort of background. I went to my local public school, but I went to university, like a lot of my friends and things like that. I've always had employment. I've never really had a difficult experience. And then I talk with these homeless people, and they've got these rich and diverse experiences that make me seem very boring in comparison and the people I get to work with. There was one homeless man that I met last year when I was 21, and our experiences were very similar. Growing up, we had fairly replicable experiences to a point where I played t-ball at the same time that he did. He went to the school next door to mine. He even was going to university at the same time that I was. Then he came out as gay to his parents, and they couldn't deal with it. For one reason or another, they really struggled with it. It was a really complex issue for them. He ended up deciding that he was going to leave that environment because it was so toxic, and he felt like he wasn't being supported and that he would be better supported on the streets. That's also a really mature step. It's probably one that I believe is incorrect in a lot of cases. But if you're not getting the support you need, taking such a dramatic step can be the only way. I really paralleled this with my own experiences when I came out, where my mum hugged me for what felt like days, and my dad turned around to me and said, "Cool." And so, very different to feeling isolated in your own home. But this is kind of like the entire story of homelessness, is that these experiences mirror our own, and there are so many steps along the way that are just like ours. But one thing happens, and then another thing comes along, and then it just becomes so overwhelming that you can't handle it on your own. So in our experience in talking with what is now over 1,000 homeless people, we've actually come up with a couple of ideas that really would dramatically change what's going on. The big one is actually relationship counselling, and this is something that really needs to be engaged at an earlier level. So one of the things that Australians are really, really great at is not talking about our feelings. We don't want to say that there's a problem. I'm particularly guilty of this. Even now, I have no interest in telling you how my day is, because it's probably not interesting to you, is what I'm thinking. But the reality is if I need help, I now know people who I can turn to. And over the past few years, I've recognised how important that is. That if I'm having a bad day, or if something isn't going my way, and I really need to just talk with someone, I know that I can call up someone and we'll go for coffee. And that'll be great. But there are so many people out there who don't have that option, who don't have those people that they can really rely on. So what we all need to do, and because tackling homelessness starts and ends with us, it is an individual responsibility as well as it is a government and business responsibility as well. But it's about recognising those around you who actually do need that support, who do need that pat on the back, who need that extra hug when it comes to it. But then also, being able to track this longer term and then being able to say, what else do you need? Because one of the really big things that makes such a huge difference is when you're able to recognise for someone that they do need this support, that they do need this help, and that you can actually provide it. And it doesn't really come at that greater cost for you. But if we let this slide, and increasingly Australia is, it becomes a really difficult problem. When someone becomes homeless, they're likely to be homeless for 4 months in the first instance. I've met people who have been homeless for decades. I've only been around for a couple of decades. So, that was when you meet people like that, that's a really complex sort of issue to be facing. But beyond relationship counselling, we also really need to get on top of financial literacy. Educate yourself about money. It seems boring, it is. But the earlier you start applying those math skills that you're learning now into the wider world and start actually saving, even though I'll admit I'm also really terrible at that, it does make a huge difference. It will be able to start to support yourself. One of the really great ideas that's being piloted at the moment in Europe and America is an idea that we can actually prevent homeless people from going homeless by having philanthropists and governments buying their houses and keeping them there. Because when people do actually go homeless, the cost is so big. It is so draining. And it affects everything from that first interaction with the police to going to jail, to the health system, to when they're at school. The list is almost endless. And it becomes really draining. And the longer they're homeless, the harder they are to help. But at the end of the day, these people are actually just like you and me. They're the sort of people that, as I was saying before, feeling a bit isolated, need that hug, need that hello, something like that. So it actually starts when you do see homeless people or when you see people that are having a hard day, to be able to go to them and say, how are you? Can I do anything for you? You look like you're having a rough trot at the moment. Do you need some water? Do you need me to do anything? Most of the time they're going to say no. And that's really okay. But having that standing offer there is what's really important. Because at the end of the day, the Australia that I believe in is one of equality and dignity and compassion. We can't actually realise that unless we all start to act it. Thanks.